In October 1941, the port city of Odessa fell silent under the boots of occupation. What followed was not a battle, but a calculated annihilation. As Romanian and German forces tightened their grip, tens of thousands of Jews were herded, shot, hanged, and burned alive. An orchestrated massacre that turned Odessa into a city of ashes and screams. Under the blazing Ukrainian sun, the city of Odessa stood as one of the most vital and cosmopolitan ports of the Black Sea. Before the war, it was home to a population of nearly 600 Zalozan people, with Jews forming roughly a third of its residents, merchants, teachers, doctors, craftsmen, and families who had lived there for generations. Odessa was a cultural mosaic, a city where Russian, Ukrainian, and Yiddish voices filled the streets, and where the hum of commerce met the rhythm of the sea. But by the autumn of 1941, this city of life was about to be turned into a graveyard. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 26, 1941, the Axis invasion of the Soviet Union swept rapidly across Eastern Europe. German and Romanian troops, under the command of Adolf Hitler and Romania's leader Ion Antonescu, launched a combined offensive through Bessarabia and into southern Ukraine. The strategic objective was to seize Odessa, a fortified port city that served as the Soviet Black Sea Fleet's principal base. The siege began in early August. Soviet forces, under the command of the separate coastal army, resisted fiercely, turning every street into a defensive line. For 73 days, the Red Army held the city against a far larger Axis force, inflicting heavy casualties on the attackers. As the siege dragged on, the city's population suffered relentless bombardments. Romanian artillery and German Luftwaffe bombers pounded Odessa day and night, setting entire neighborhoods ablaze. The civilian death toll mounted as food supplies dwindled and disease spread. Yet, the Soviet defenders refused to surrender. Hitler, frustrated by the delays, pressed Antonescu to complete the operation quickly. The Romanians, eager to prove themselves to their German allies and reclaim Bessarabia and Bukovina, territories lost to the Soviets in 1940, intensified their assault. By early October, the Soviet High Command recognized that Odessa could no longer be held. On October 16, 1941, Soviet forces began their evacuation by sea, withdrawing the last troops and leaving behind tens of thousands of civilians, including a large Jewish population that had nowhere to escape. That same day, Romanian troops of the Fourth Army marched into Odessa. The city's occupation was a moment of triumph for Antonescu's regime, celebrated in Bucharest as a major victory. But the joy of conquest quickly turned to vengeance. Antonescu's government blamed Jews and communists for the heavy Romanian losses suffered during the siege. In total, over 90,000 Romanian soldiers had been killed, wounded, or gone missing in the battle for Odessa. The occupiers, driven by rage and racial ideology, were ready to exact retribution. Immediately after the fall of the city, Romanian military authorities established strict martial law. Odessa was placed under the command of General Ion Glogojanu, whose headquarters were located in the former NKVD building. A choice that would soon carry a fatal irony. Romanian troops began rounding up remaining Soviet officials, suspected partisans, and large numbers of Jewish men. Mass arrests filled makeshift prisons and detention centers across the city. Within days, rumors spread among the local population that severe reprisals were being planned, but no one could have imagined the scale of what was to come. On October 22, just 6 days after the city's occupation, a devastating explosion ripped through the Romanian military headquarters. A time bomb, left behind by retreating Soviet forces, detonated in the basement of the NKVD building, killing General Glogojanu, several senior Romanian officers, and dozens of soldiers. The blast shattered windows across the district and sent columns of smoke into the air. Within hours, Romanian authorities concluded, without investigation, that local Jews and communists were to blame. The response was swift and merciless. That same evening, the Romanian command in Odessa, following orders from Bucharest, began organizing a mass retaliation. The directives were clear: for every Romanian officer killed, 200 Jews were to be executed. For every Romanian soldier, 100. The figures were staggering. Thousands of deaths ordered in a single decree. Military police and gendarmes, supported by German Einsatzgruppe, D units stationed nearby, began preparing execution sites. Jewish men were seized from the streets, dragged from their homes, and rounded up in assembly points throughout the city. Entire families were caught in the sweeps. Many were marched to the harbour, others to the outskirts near Dalnik and Slobodka. The sound of boots shouted orders, and cries of terror echoed through Odessa's darkened streets. By nightfall, hundreds had already been executed. Romanian soldiers shot prisoners against walls and dumped the bodies in hastily dug pits. The first wave of killings was brutal and disorganized. But by the next morning, October 23, the operation took on a methodical character. Romanian Colonel Nicolae de Leoniu and other officers coordinated with German SS advisors to ensure the exterminations would proceed systematically. Jews from all parts of Odessa were ordered to gather at designated locations under threat of death. Thousands obeyed, believing they were being relocated. They were taken under guard to the outskirts of the city, where barns, warehouses, and stables were converted into killing sites. The massacre began in earnest on October 23 and continued over the following days. One of the central locations was the area near Dalnik, a small village outside Odessa. Here, the Romanian military gathered tens of thousands of Jews. Rows of people were forced to strip off their clothes and valuables. They were shot in groups beside dug trenches, their bodies falling in heaps. Those still alive were finished off by machine gun fire. The Romanian gendarmes worked relentlessly, assisted by German troops and local collaborators. Witnesses described blood-soaked fields, where the cries of the dying mingled with the steady rhythm of gunfire. But even mass shootings were not enough to satisfy the vengeance of the occupiers. Romanian commanders ordered the use of hangings to make an example of their victims. Across Odessa, gallows were erected in public squares and along main streets. Dozens of Jews were strung up from lampposts, balconies, and telephone poles, their bodies left to hang for days. Passers-by were forced to witness the spectacle. Photographs taken by Axis soldiers show rows of corpses swaying in the wind, a grim warning of what awaited those who defied the new order. The occupation had transformed Odessa into an open, air execution ground. On October 24, the killings escalated further. Romanian troops herded thousands of Jewish men, women, and children into large warehouses and stables in the outskirts, particularly in the area of Dalnik. The buildings were packed so tightly that people could barely move. Soldiers poured gasoline over the structures and set them alight. The flames spread rapidly, consuming the wooden walls and trapping those inside. As the fires raged, the screams of the burning victims filled the night. Anyone who tried to escape was shot on sight. The inferno burned for hours, leaving behind only charred remains and the stench of death. The next morning, the soldiers returned to ensure that no one had survived. The number of those killed in these mass burnings alone was estimated at over 25,000. Survivors from nearby villages later recalled the glow of the fires visible from miles away. In the following days, Romanian soldiers continued their hunts for Jews who had evaded the first round of killings. House-to-house searches were conducted. Those discovered in hiding were executed immediately. Jewish hospitals were emptied, patients shot in their beds. Children were not spared. By October 25, the entire Jewish population of Odessa had effectively been targeted for extermination. Romanian General Nicolae Ranu, who oversaw the operation, reported to Antonescu that the reprisals were complete, describing the massacre in cold, bureaucratic terms. Antonescu in Bucharest expressed satisfaction and ordered that deportations of remaining Jews should follow. The killings in Odessa were not random acts of chaos, but part of a broader Romanian policy of ethnic cleansing that had already begun in Bessarabia and Bukovina earlier that summer. The Romanian regime viewed Jews as enemies of the state and accomplices of Soviet communism, a belief encouraged and reinforced by Nazi ideology. The massacre in Odessa was one of the most extreme expressions of this policy. By late October, the streets of Odessa were lined with corpses. The city's once bustling Jewish quarter had been reduced to silence. Smoke from the burned warehouses still hung in the air. The survivors, mostly women, children, and the elderly, were rounded up and placed in temporary ghettos on the outskirts of the city. Conditions were appalling. Hunger, disease, and exposure took countless more lives in the weeks that followed. Romanian troops looted abandoned homes and businesses. German photographers documented the destruction, their images later found among the archives of the Einsatzgruppen. In November 1941, Antonescu's government began implementing the next phase of their plan, the deportation of all surviving Jews from Odessa and the surrounding Transnistria region. Columns of prisoners, numbering in the tens of thousands, were forced to march through freezing conditions toward camps deep inside occupied territory. The routes were long and deadly. Guards shot anyone who fell behind. Many froze to death on the roadside, those who reached their destinations. Villages and towns converted into concentration sites. Faced starvation, forced labor, and disease. Transnistria, a territory between the Dniester and Bug rivers administered by Romania, became a vast killing ground. Between 1941 and 1944, more than 300,000 Jews from Bessarabia, Bukovina, and Odessa perished there. In the months following the massacre, Odessa remained under Romanian occupation. The city's surviving population was subjected to strict racial laws. Jews were banned from public life, forced to wear identifying badges, and prohibited from leaving assigned zones. The Romanian authorities established a puppet municipal administration and began a campaign to Romanianize the city, renaming streets, confiscating property, and repopulating Jewish homes with ethnic Romanians. But beneath this facade of control, Odessa was haunted by the memory of what had occurred. The ruins of the burned warehouses and the mass graves at Dalnik stood as silent witnesses. In early 1942, German SS officers stationed in southern Ukraine compiled reports detailing the Odessa events. Their records, combined with Romanian military dispatches, confirmed that over 50,000 Jews had been killed in the massacre of October 1941. The Romanian regime attempted to portray the atrocities as justified retaliation for the bombing that had killed their officers. But even German commanders were taken aback by the sheer scale and brutality of the reprisals. The massacre at Odessa became one of the largest single mass killings of Jews during the early phase of the Holocaust, preceding the establishment of extermination camps. As the war continued, the Romanian occupation of Transnistria became increasingly harsh. Hundreds of thousands of deportees died of hunger, disease, and exposure in makeshift ghettos and camps such as Bogdanovka, Domanovka, and Akhmetchetka. Entire convoys of Jews from Odessa vanished into these desolate zones, their names unrecorded. Few ever returned. The Romanian administration, operating under the supervision of German advisors, continued to enforce policies of annihilation while denying direct participation in genocide. Yet the evidence, military orders, field reports, and survivor testimonies left no doubt about the intent. By 1943, as the tide of war turned against the Axis, Romanian leaders began to fear retribution. The Soviet Red Army was advancing westward, retaking lost territories. In Odessa, rumors spread that liberation might soon come, but the scars of the massacre were permanent. When Soviet troops re-entered the city in April 1944, they found mass graves scattered around Dalnik and Slobodka, containing thousands of skeletal remains. Investigations were launched immediately. Witnesses described the events in harrowing detail. The shootings, the hangings, the burnings. Soviet war crimes commissions documented the findings, creating one of the earliest records of Holocaust atrocities in Eastern Europe. In the aftermath, the Romanian regime sought to obscure its responsibility. Antonescu continued to claim that the massacre was a legitimate act of military reprisal. But after the war, when Romania switched sides in 1944 and joined the Allies, the full extent of the atrocities began to emerge. During the 1946 People's Tribunal in Bucharest, Ion Antonescu and several of his generals were tried for war crimes, including the Odessa Massacre. Witnesses testified about the orders given, the numbers of victims, and the horrific methods used. Antonescu was convicted and executed in 1946. Other officers received prison sentences, though many escaped justice. For decades, the massacre at Odessa remained one of the less publicized chapters of the Holocaust, overshadowed by the industrial killings of Auschwitz and Treblinka. Yet it stood as a grim reminder that genocide took many forms: machine guns, fire, starvation, and that it was carried out not only by Germans, but by their allies. Modern historians estimate that between 50,000 and 60,000 Jews were murdered in Odessa between October 22 and the end of December 1941. The killings marked one of the largest single massacres on Soviet territory during the Nazi occupation. Today, the site of the Dalnik warehouses lies on the outskirts of modern Odessa, marked by memorial stones and plaques. Beneath the soil rest the ashes of thousands, families, children, the elderly, whose lives were extinguished in those terrible days. Archival photographs show the faces of the victims and their city before its destruction, a place of light, commerce, and culture. Their memory endures as a testament to what hatred and vengeance can unleash when fueled by ideology and war. The Odessa Massacre was not a spontaneous act of chaos, but a meticulously organized operation, a convergence of military order, anti-Semitic policy, and human cruelty. In the autumn of 1941, as the fires consumed the bodies of the innocent, Odessa became a symbol of the Holocaust's early brutality, a city where tens of thousands perished in a matter of days, erased not by bombs or battles, but by deliberate human hands. When the Soviet Red Army re-entered Odessa in April 1944, the city they found was unrecognizable. Once a bustling port alive with the sounds of ships, markets, and music, Odessa had been stripped bare by years of occupation and war. The streets were cracked and hollow, the harbor mined and half destroyed, and the air still carried the faint odor of charred wood and oil. The Jews who had once made up a third of the city's population were almost entirely gone. Only a few hundred remained, many in hiding or posing as non-Jews to survive. Soviet soldiers advancing through the outskirts of the city began to uncover the first signs of what had happened 2.5 years earlier. In fields near Dalnik, shallow earthworks concealed the bones of thousands. The ground was uneven, collapsing in places where the earth had sunk into the decomposing remains beneath. Within days of liberation, Soviet authorities began formal investigations. The Extraordinary State Commission for the Investigation of German fascist crimes arrived in Odessa to collect evidence. Teams of soldiers, doctors, and engineers excavated the pits where civilians had been executed. The air around the sites filled with the smell of decay as they uncovered bodies still dressed in civilian clothes. Men, women, and children, many with their hands bound behind their backs. Bullet holes were visible in skulls. Some bodies were burned beyond recognition, remnants of those who had perished in the fires of the warehouses. The Soviet investigators interviewed surviving witnesses, villagers who had watched from a distance as columns of Jews were marched to their deaths, peasants who had been forced to help dig graves, and the few who had managed to crawl from beneath the bodies and survive. Their testimonies, written in longhand on official paper, became among the earliest documentary records of mass extermination on the Eastern Front. The witnesses described the events in precise detail. They spoke of how, on October 23, 1941, Romanian and German soldiers had brought thousands of Jews to the Dalnik area, ordering them to strip before being shot. They described the warehouses where people were herded in by the thousands, the doors nailed shut, and then set ablaze. One survivor told investigators how she had hidden under bodies as the fire spread, hearing the screams fade as smoke filled the room. When she crawled out after dawn, the ground was still hot and the air was thick with ash. Another witness, a farmer from a nearby village, told how soldiers patrolled the burning buildings and shot anyone who tried to escape through the windows. He said that afterward, the soldiers poured more fuel on the smoldering ruins to erase all trace of the victims. The Soviet Commission concluded that more than 50,000 Jews had been murdered in and around Odessa during those days of October 1941. As the investigation expanded, Soviet forces discovered mass graves in other parts of Transnistria, the territory between the Dniester and Bug rivers that had served as the Romanian occupation zone. What began in Odessa had spread outward, forming part of a much larger campaign of extermination carried out by the Romanian military and police. From late 1941 through 1943, Jews from Odessa and surrounding regions were deported in vast columns to camps deep in Transnistria. The deportations began just weeks after the massacre. Romanian gendarmes, following direct orders from Governor Gheorghe Alexianu, began clearing Odessa's temporary ghettos. The operation was carried out in the middle of winter. Families were given only minutes to gather belongings before being herded into long columns that stretched for miles. Those who fell behind were shot where they stood. The deportees were driven eastward across the Dniester, through blizzards and across frozen rivers, toward the small towns and villages that had been converted into makeshift camps. Many died on the march. Their bodies, stripped of clothing by guards or desperate survivors, were left along the roadside. Those who reached the camps found only misery waiting. The largest sites, Bogdanovka, Domanovka, and Akhmetchetka, were little more than clusters of barns and huts without heat or sanitation. Romanian authorities had dumped tens of thousands of people there with almost no food. Typhus spread quickly. The sick lay beside the dead, and guards refused to allow burials until the stench became unbearable. In the winter of 1941-42 alone, tens of thousands perished in these camps. At Bogdanovka, the extermination reached new extremes. In December 1941, as disease spread uncontrollably, the Romanian gendarmes decided to eliminate the camp's remaining inhabitants. Over the course of 2 weeks, nearly 48,000 Jews were shot, burned, or driven into frozen pits. Witnesses later recounted how Romanian soldiers, assisted by local Ukrainian police and ethnic German militias, forced the prisoners into barns, poured fuel over them, and set them on fire. Those who tried to flee were gunned down. The killings at Bogdanovka reveled the largest single massacres of the war, yet they were carried out with scarcely any outside attention. Similar scenes unfolded across the region, in Domanovka, Golta, and Berezovka, where Romanian occupation authorities conducted systematic exterminations under the pretext of cleansing operations. By 1942, Transnistria had become a zone of death. The Jews of Odessa, who had survived the October massacre, now found themselves in the same fate, perishing from starvation, cold, or bullets. Few could escape. The region was heavily patrolled, and the local population, itself terrorized by the occupiers, had little means to help. Yet, scattered accounts tell of peasants who hid children or shared food with passing convoys. These acts of mercy were rare, but remembered by those who lived to tell their stories after the war. Meanwhile, in Odessa itself, the city remained under tight Romanian control. The occupation administration, led by Governor Alexianu, continued to enforce racial laws. All Jewish property was confiscated. Synagogues were closed or destroyed. Romanian settlers and officials took over homes, businesses, and offices once belonging to the Jewish community. Street names were changed to Romanian, and propaganda posters covered walls, declaring the city liberated from Bolshevism and Jewry. But beneath the appearance of order, Odessa was plagued by fear. Soviet partisans operated in the outskirts, launching sporadic attacks on Romanian garrisons and supply depots. In retaliation, occupation authorities executed hostages, often the few remaining Jews or suspected sympathizers. Each new attack brought new rounds of killings. Throughout 1942 and 1943, as Germany's fortunes on the Eastern Front began to wane, the Romanian administration in Transnistria grew more desperate. The front lines were drawing closer. Food shortages worsened. Even Romanian soldiers began to suffer from hunger and disease. Yet the deportations and executions continued. Reports sent to Bucharest by military commanders detailed the declining conditions. But Antonescu's regime refused to halt the policies. In official correspondence, Romanian officers referred to the Jews not as citizens but as a burden and a security threat. These words translated into orders that sealed the fate of thousands more. By late 1943, the war was turning decisively against the Axis. After the German defeat at Stalingrad and the collapse of the front in southern Ukraine, Romanian forces began to retreat. Soviet partisans intensified their attacks, and the Red Army advanced rapidly toward Transnistria. In March 1944, the front reached the Dniester. Romanian troops, exhausted and demoralized, abandoned many camps without evacuating the prisoners. Those who could walk tried to follow the retreating columns. The rest were left behind. When Soviet units entered the region, they found scenes of devastation, villages filled with unburied corpses, camps where the living lay beside the dead, and piles of bones in the ashes of burned barns. Of the hundreds of thousands of Jews deported to Transnistria, only a small fraction survived to see liberation. As the Soviets re-established control, they began collecting evidence for future war crimes trials. The investigations extended beyond Odessa to the entire Romanian occupied zone. Documents seized from Romanian headquarters revealed the orders for the October 1941 reprisals. Dispatches between Antonescu's general staff and the Odessa command detailed the numbers of executions carried out and confirmed that the killings were premeditated. The Soviet authorities used this evidence during the post-war tribunals that followed the fall of the Axis powers. After the war, as Europe struggled to rebuild, the magnitude of the Odessa Massacre slowly came to light. Many of the Romanian officers responsible had fled or were captured by Soviet troops. In 1945, Ion Antonescu was arrested, along with several members of his wartime government. The People's Tribunal in Bucharest, established under Soviet supervision, opened proceedings the following year. Survivors of Odessa and Transnistria testified before the court, recounting the atrocities in chilling detail. They described the burning warehouses, the marches through snow, and the endless shootings. Photographs, documents, and eyewitness accounts were presented as evidence. Antonescu, unrepentant, insisted that the reprisals were necessary acts of war. His defense did not convince the judges. He was found guilty of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the deportation and extermination of Jews. On June 1, 1946, he was executed by firing squad near Gilova prison. In the following years, several Romanian generals and administrators were also convicted, including Gheorghe Alexianu, the governor of Transnistria, and General Nicolae Masici, who had commanded forces during the Odessa operation. Yet many lower-ranking officers escaped punishment. Romania's post-war political turmoil, shifting alliances, and the onset of the Cold War allowed some perpetrators to fade into obscurity. Still, the memory of Odessa lingered in survivor testimonies, in the Soviet archives, and in the silent graves scattered across southern Ukraine. For decades, the massacre was mentioned only briefly in official histories. The Soviet Union portrayed the atrocities primarily as fascist crimes against Soviet citizens, emphasizing the suffering of all peoples under occupation rather than the specifically Jewish nature of the genocide. Memorials erected in Odessa during the post-war years spoke of victims of fascism, without identifying them as Jews. Yet among survivors and their descendants, the memory endured privately, passed through stories whispered in homes, and through the few photographs that had survived the war. It was not until the late 20th century that the Odessa Massacre began to receive full historical attention. As archives opened and historians gained access to Romanian military records, the scale and organization of the killings became clearer. The documents revealed that the massacre had been planned and approved at the highest levels of the Romanian government. Orders bore Antonescu's signature. Reports from officers described, with chilling precision, how many Jews had been executed each day and how much ammunition had been used. These findings showed that the Odessa massacre was not a spontaneous outburst of vengeance, but part of a systematic policy of extermination aligned with Nazi Germany's broader genocidal goals. Modern researchers pieced together the identities of many victims from pre-war census data, synagogue records, and family archives. Their work uncovered the names of entire families erased from Odessa's streets in October 1941. In the 1990s and 2000s, Ukraine and Romania both undertook official efforts to commemorate the victims. In Odessa, new memorials were erected near Dalnik, marking the sites of mass graves. One monument, shaped like a stone arch, bears inscriptions in Ukrainian, Romanian, Hebrew, and Russian, acknowledging the tens of thousands who were shot, burned, and hanged. Each year, survivors' descendants gather there to light candles and read the names of the lost. In Romania, the process of confronting the past was slow and often contentious. For decades after the war, Ion Antonescu was remembered by some as a nationalist leader who had defended the country's sovereignty, a view that obscured his role in the Holocaust. It was not until 2004 that the Romanian government officially recognized the massacre at Odessa as part of the Holocaust and accepted responsibility for the deaths of more than 280,000 Jews and 11,000 Roma in territories under Romanian control. The International Commission on the Holocaust in Romania, chaired by Elie Wiesel, concluded that Romania had committed genocide independently of Germany's direct orders. This acknowledgement marked a turning point in public understanding of the Odessa tragedy. In Odessa itself, the scars of war remain faintly visible in the old city's walls and foundations. The buildings once used as headquarters, prisons, and barracks still stand, their facades restored but their histories unforgotten. Beneath the city's catacombs lie tunnels that once sheltered partisans and civilians during the occupation. Archaeologists and historians occasionally discover remnants of those days: shell casings, charred fragments, personal belongings buried in haste. Each artifact adds another fragment to the story of what happened in those weeks of 1941. The Odessa Massacre was one of the earliest large-scale exterminations of Jews on the Eastern Front, preceding the establishment of industrial death camps in occupied Poland. It demonstrated how quickly ideology and vengeance could merge into genocide, executed through conventional military structures rather than specialized killing centers. The Romanian army, acting with its own command chain, carried out the massacre with efficiency and purpose, using bullets, fire, and starvation as instruments of annihilation. The German Einsatzgruppe units that operated alongside them documented the killings, but did not direct them, underscoring that Romania's participation in the Holocaust was both independent and extensive. By the end of the war, the once thriving Jewish community of Odessa was virtually gone. From the 180,000 Jews who lived there before the invasion, only a few thousand survived, many having fled east with the Soviet evacuation in 1941 or hidden under false identities. When they returned after liberation, they found empty homes, looted synagogues, and the absence of neighbors who would never come back. Yet, the survivors rebuilt. Odessa's post-war Jewish life slowly revived, even under Soviet restrictions. The city's synagogues reopened in the decades that followed, and new generations grew up among the ruins of memory, unaware at first of the full magnitude of the destruction that had taken place beneath their feet. As time passed, the massacre faded from public awareness, overshadowed by other wartime tragedies. But archival research and survivor accounts have restored its place in the history of the Holocaust. The story of Odessa is not merely one of loss, but of revelation, of how records buried in boxes and graves unearthed decades later spoke again for the silenced. Through testimony, investigation, and remembrance, the events of October 1941 remain part of the world's collective memory, preserved not only in documents, but in the enduring voice of history that refuses to be erased. In the years that followed the war, Odessa rebuilt itself from ruins. The harbour reopened, ships once again filled the docks, and factories roared back to life. Yet beneath the rhythm of recovery lay the silence of those who had vanished. Streets that once echoed with Yiddish songs and the chatter of merchants were now quiet, their names erased from records and gravestones, hidden under new foundations. The Soviet authorities restored the city's grandeur, but not its memory. Public discussion of the massacre was forbidden, replaced by a single narrative of Soviet citizens who had perished under fascist occupation. For survivors who had returned, remembrance became an act of quiet defiance. Candles lit in secret, prayers whispered at unmarked fields, the names of lost children spoken only within trusted circles. Decades passed before the truth of what happened in Odessa was allowed to resurface. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, archives long sealed by military censors were finally opened. Files from the Extraordinary State Commission revealed thousands of pages of evidence, witness statements, autopsy reports, military dispatches, and photographs of the burned warehouses at Dalnik. Historians traced the chain of command that led from the Romanian Fourth Army to Bucharest, uncovering the orders that authorized the massacre. Families across Eastern Europe, searching for their ancestry, found fragments of their relatives' names among those lists. Birth certificates, deportation registers, the final notations of the dead. In the early 2000s, memorial stones began to rise on the outskirts of Odessa, marking the sites of the executions and burnings. Each bore inscriptions in several languages: Hebrew, Ukrainian, Romanian, and Russian, bearing witness to the thousands who had died without graves. Survivors and their descendants came from across the world to stand where their families had perished. The Dalnik fields, once filled with blood and smoke, became places of quiet remembrance. On the anniversary of the massacre, the wind carried the sound of prayers over the earth, where the fires had once burned. In Romania, decades of denial slowly gave way to acknowledgement. Documents once buried in military archives confirmed that the orders had come directly from the government of Ion Antonescu, implemented with precision by Romanian troops. The findings of the International Commission in 2004 established that Romania had participated fully in the Holocaust, responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Jews and Roma across its occupied territories. Memorials were erected in Bucharest, Iti, and across the former killing grounds of Transnistria, their inscriptions finally naming what had long been denied. Today, Odessa's old Jewish quarter remains a shadow of what it once was. The Great Synagogue has been restored, its walls echoing again with prayer, but the community that fills it is small. The streets surrounding it, where life once thrived in a dozen languages, stand as reminders of what war and hatred erased. In the archives and memorials of Ukraine and Romania, the story of the Odessa Massacre endures. 50,000 lives extinguished in the span of days, a city turned to ash, and a silence that lasted for generations. Yet from that silence emerged memory, and from memory, the unbroken record of what must never be forgotten.